Hi, hello to everyone. We hope that you are going well. Today we are going to share with you how to make a perfect meringue. I'm going to explain different kinds of classic meringues. Then we are going to give you solutions of the problems that we have in some meringues, because maybe some of them they have a lot of sugar or they are not stable for the process of freezing and thaw process. And I'm going to share with you different tips. Feel free, if you want to have questions, to share with us all the questions in the chat, and at the end of this webinar we are going to share with you all these answers. We will try to answer as much as possible. And also we are going to share with you the promotional video of our BConcept online extended course, and I'm going to explain a little bit just in 4 or 5 minutes how it works, this course, and how to enroll in it. Okay, let's go to start. I'm here with Ramon, and we are going to share with you this presentation that we prepared about how to make a perfect meringue. Let's go to start with the first part of the presentation. Meringues is a kind of preparation that we can use in pastry in different kind of recipes. For example, we can use for decoration of cakes, tarts. We can use for a base of creams like chiboust, for example, that we are working with pastry, cream, and meringue, and also, for example, for mousses. No, in mousses, in general, we use Italian meringue because it's much more stable than French meringue, and we are going to explain why this difference. And let's go to see what kind of different meringues we have and how we can manage to make, for example, healthier versions to remove sugars and work with other sugars that are better. No? That means that meringue we can use in any direction. Also, meringue we can dry in an oven and we can have like crunchy texture, like for example pavlova or like macaron, that is a kind of meringue that we recrystallize, where we add almond powder inside. And let's go to start with the first meringue that we have today. No, the first meringue that we are going to analyze is French meringue. French meringue, we can find different percentage of egg whites and sugar. No, the classic one maybe can be 40% of egg whites and 60% of sugar, but then we have other options like French meringues that we have 50% of sugar, 50% of egg whites, and even we can have like classic recipes that they have 70% of sugar and 30% of egg whites. No? And this is a huge quantity in general of sugar. No? I'm going to propose another kind of recipe of French meringue that we can use, for example, for mousses, that works perfect and is stable, but always thinking in mousses, no? Usability. Now we are going just to share with you this recipe, and I'm going to explain a little bit how it works, French meringue. No? Here, as you can see, we completely change the proportion of sugar and egg whites. That means that in classic recipes we can have like 50-50, like 60-40, but 60% of sugar, 40% of egg whites, and even 70% of sugar, 30% of egg whites. No? And here in that recipe we have 60% of egg whites and 40% of sugar. No? And this recipe is perfect, for example, for use in mousses, where we can use, we want to add air inside of the recipe, using a meringue, but without using cream. No? For example, imagine that we want to prepare hazelnut mousse, and we have hazelnut as a main ingredient, and instead of use cream in that recipe, we want to use a meringue. No? This meringue, this French meringue, with low quantity of sugar, 40%, we can use in that recipe in order to introduce air. This air is going to help us to have a sweet and airy, light and airy texture, and this sugar is going to help us to sweet the recipe. That means that this kind of French meringue we can use for mousses without any problem, but when we need sugar inside of the recipe, then I'm going to give you a solution of a meringue without sugar. That can be also interesting when we have main ingredients like, for example, white chocolate or milk chocolate that contains a lot of sugar. But now we are thinking in a meringue that is a French meringue just with 40% of sugar and 60% of egg white. I'm going just to explain the process because the process is a little bit particular and different. What we are going to do is we have pasteurized egg whites, but this can be fresh egg whites also. I will explain at the end what is the difference between egg whites and pasteurized egg whites. That means that here in the process we are going to whisk the egg whites for 4 minutes, more or less, until we have soft peaks. We have a little bit of foam, no? Soft peaks texture, and then we are going to add sugar and we are going to whisk for 6 minutes more. And what we do in general is to heat up a little bit the preparation at the beginning. That means that I'm going to introduce on the standing machine, on the robot, the egg whites. We are going to start to whisk the egg whites, and at the same time, at the beginning, we are going to apply, for example, hot air with a heating gun, or we can work with a torch, for example, and this is because we need to arrive until 30 degrees, 35 degrees, and at this temperature, the development of the protein will be much better than if we work with the proteins, with the egg whites that are completely cold from the fridge. No, that means that always in all the meringues that we are going to prepare, we are going to heat up the egg whites at 30 degrees, and then we will whisk 4 minutes, add the sugar, 6 minutes more, and this will be a perfect process. No? And at the end, we can, for example, mix with the other part of the recipe that we can have. Okay? Then we have another presentation that is Italian meringue, for example, and Swiss meringue. Here we see different proportions. No? What is the difference between French meringue, Italian meringue? Here the difference, the big difference is the cooking process. In general, when we work with French meringue, what we do is just whisk egg whites, add sugar in different proportions, and then use it. In Italian meringue, it's different. We have a base of egg whites, and then we have water and sugar that we are going to bring to 100, in general 20 degrees, more or less 118, 121. And what is interesting in this kind of meringue, Italian meringue, is that when we mix the syrup at 120 degrees with the egg whites at 30, 40 degrees, what we do is to set the proteins that we have inside of the whites. Not all the proteins, but we gellify some part of the proteins that we have inside of these egg whites. And this helps us to give us more stability. For this reason, when we freeze, for example, French meringue, and when we freeze Italian meringue, in general, Italian meringue has much more stability on the freezing and thaw process. No? That means that we have the possibility to freeze Italian meringue, defreeze, thaw, and we will see that it's completely stable. No? And in the other side, we will have like French meringue, and this French meringue will be, the water will be leaking out. No? And this is because the difference of the process. No? In once we have a gelation process, is one of the techniques that we explain in our course. Gelation is a technique that we use in all kind of recipes, always when we use, for example, gelatin, when we use agar-agar, when we use pectins in the recipes, and it's a technique very important to create the structures that we need in pastry. No? And here in that meringue is that this is what happens. No? We have Italian meringue cooking process 60, 65, even 70 degrees, and at 70 degrees there is a part of the proteins that we have on the whites that they set, they gellify, and this gives us much more stability. In that recipe of Italian meringue, we have 34% of egg whites, 55% of sugar, and then we have water 11%. This water is going to be partly evaporate on the cooking process, no? But still we will have, like, for example, 5%, 4% of water at the end of the cooking process at 120 degrees, and once we will mix, this water will be mixed on the final recipe. Something good of this meringue is the stability, no? That we have for the freezing and thaw process, and contains a little bit less sugar than in general French classic meringue, okay? Then we have, for the Swiss meringue, next recipe will be, perfecte. Here we can, podem tornar a l'Italian meringue? Yes, okay, let's go to see the Italian meringue. This is a classic recipe of Italian meringue. It's 11% of water, 55% of sugar, and 34% of egg whites. And here what we are going to do is to bring water and sugar 121 degrees. It's just an example, 180 degrees is okay also. And we are going to start to whisk the egg whites a little bit, heating at 30 degrees, and like that we will improve the development of the proteins that we have on the egg whites. And then once we have 121 degrees and soft peaks on the egg whites, we are going to mix the syrup with the egg whites, and then we are going to cool down until 20 degrees, and we will use, no? And this we can make at more or less the 80% of the speed of the machine, no? In general, we always say medium-high speed, no? That means around 70-80% of the speed that you have in your machine. And once it's cold, you can use directly in your recipes for mousses, for example, or for macaron. Okay, there is no problem. Let's go to see now the Swiss meringue. What is the difference between Italian meringue and Swiss meringue? Here in the Swiss meringue, what we do is to heat, but we heat until 50-60 degrees. No? That means that what we do is to heat the egg whites with sugar, high quantity of sugar, and we bring all this preparation to 60 degrees. And once it's at 60 degrees, what we do at this temperature is to be sure that all the sugar that we have on the recipe will be completely melted, and like that the proteins, they are going to whisk on the right conditions. No? That means that we bring until 50-60 degrees. Until 60 degrees there is no gelation process, but then more than 60 degrees we will have gelation process, and this is not interesting in this kind of meringue. Okay, let's go to work between 50-60 degrees. We start to whisk, and then once we have the volume that we need for the meringue, we can add, for example, cornstarch in order to improve the stability. That means that, for example, if this Swiss meringue, we want to make a decoration, no, with a piping bag, and we want to dry in oven 100 degrees during 4, 5, 6 hours until it's completely dry, or we can work in a warm cabinet, for example, at 50 degrees, and we will have one day to the other day. And this starch that we will introduce on the recipe, if we do the process, the dry process, more than 80 degrees, this starch is going to absorb water of the egg whites, and it's going to give us much more stability. This cornstarch that you have in this Swiss meringue is optional. You don't need to use, you can use only sugar and egg whites, but if you want to make a little bit better stability in your meringue, you can introduce this starch, okay? And that's it. Another thing that I didn't tell to you about Italian meringue. Sometimes we have a problem with the Italian meringue is that we heat water and sugar, for example, in an induction, and the inductions goes very fast. Sometimes we have the water that is completely boiling and sugar is not melted. That means that always in an Italian meringue you have to be careful to heat a little bit, no, a little bit. No, that means that you will warm the water a little bit, you will add sugar, and you increase the temperature little by little, and once you start to boil, you have to see that all the sugar crystals are completely melted. If not, you reduce the power of your induction, no? And like that, we are going to be sure that at the end of the process, at 120 degrees, your sugar will be completely melted, no? And there will be no sugar crystals inside of your syrup, no? And then you can just directly mix without any problem, okay? Now it's time to explain. We are going to explain about egg white proteins, no? If we see the ingredients that we have in meringues, we have, like, in general, 2 ingredients. We have egg whites, that I'm going to explain right now. And then we can see that we have like sugar. In general, everybody is using sugar, but since long time we are using fibers that are so interesting in meringues in order to reduce sugar and in the recipes and make healthier version of our pastries. And I'm going to explain right now how to make this kind of meringues, but before to start to explain this kind of meringues with fibers and other ingredients like polyalcohols, for example, I'm going to explain first egg whites. No? What we need to understand is that when we prepare a meringue, we have like in general two ingredients. We have egg whites and we have sugar. Sugar on the recipe is going to give us sweetness because sugar is sweet. And also it's going to give us dry extract. No? What is dry extract? In general, this is something that we explain in our courses, no? That dry extract is everything that is not water in all the ingredients that we use in pastry. That means that, for example, in butter we have fats, we have a small quantity of proteins, a small quantity of sugars, no, lactose sugar, and the rest in general is water. That means that more or less we have like 82% of fat, we have around 0.8, 1% of proteins, then we have more or less 0.5, 0.8, 1% of lactose sugar, no, sugars, carbohydrates, and in the addition of these three ingredients, if we have, for example, 84%, the rest will be until 100% will be water. No? That means that proteins, carbohydrates, fats are dry ingredients that we have. No? And in this case, sugar is a completely dry ingredient that gives us stability, sweetness, and dry extract, no? In the recipe. Then we have egg white proteins, no? Egg whites, sorry. And inside of the egg whites, we have the proteins. In egg whites, we have a huge quantity of water. As you can see on the screen, we have 89% of water, more or less. And in general, then we have 11% of different proteins. The big protein that we have in egg whites is ovalbumin. That is the main protein that we have inside. No? But then we have small quantities of different proteins, and all of these proteins, this 11%, is going to work for us to give us the capacity to introduce there inside of our meringues, no? And how they work, these proteins. We are going to see just a small draw of how they work. La próxima dashboard. Here we have the how they work the egg whites, no? The egg whites or the egg white proteins, in general, they are closed. As you can see on the first part of the draw, they are completely closed. We start to apply energy with a whisk, for example, and these proteins, they start to open. No? And once they start to open, they create a new links, a new network, and in this way, what they do is to introduce air inside to capture the air and keep the air inside of these nets that we created with the different proteins that we have inside of the egg whites. And this is how it works in a meringue. No? For this reason, always in a meringue we have to heat up at 30 degrees because we improve this process that you see on the screen, and then apply energy with a whisk, start to whisk in a medium-high speed, and once we develop the proteins, we introduce sugar and we finalize the process. No? And like that, we will have a perfect result of a meringue. Okay. In the next presentation, we can see the first part of the meringue with that we presented, the meringue with white sugar, the meringue that is French meringue, was French meringue style, but less sugar, more egg whites. In this case, we have 40% of sugar, 60% of egg whites. This we are going to use, as I mentioned, in recipes, like for example, mousses, that the main ingredient doesn't contain sugar, and we want to add sugar inside of the recipe. Then we have the second meringue, that is a meringue with whole sugars. Why is interesting this meringue with whole sugars? Because in general, when we work with white sugar, we don't have any vitamins and minerals. And I think that it is if there is something interesting in pastry is that first, we can reduce sugars, no? This is something that we completely explain in our course, how to reduce sugars on the recipes, because we have a pandemic with sugar that is completely unhealthy product that we have to reduce, and we are agree of use sugar, but use the small quantity that we need to create a perfect experience, and then work with other ingredients that will give us stability on the recipe. No? For this reason, first step for us is reduction of sugar, and then try to use whole sugars. That means that always I prefer to use, for example, coconut sugar or whole cane sugar before to use completely white sugar. No, I use white sugar when, for example, I'm going to prepare a mango mousse and I want to keep a perfect color, and here I'm using white sugar. But in general, if I'm going to use, for example, nuts, if I'm going to use cacao, if I'm going to use different ingredients that they have dark color, in all these kind of recipes, I can use, for example, coconut sugar, whole cane sugar, like, for example, panela that we call in Spanish. And this kind of sugars, they have much more better profile than, for example, white sugar. We can have some vitamins, we can have some minerals, and this will help us to create a product that are with a nutritional profile much more interesting. No? It's not a huge difference, but it's much better. And with flours, it's exactly the same. Always we prefer to use, when it's possible, flours, whole flours than just completely white flours, no? Because it's exactly the same. On the process of remove fibers, vitamins, and minerals, we lose a lot of things that are so interesting for our body. And for this reason, always when we're going to prepare, for example, a sponge with chocolate, a sponge with pistachio, a sponge with hazelnut, we can use, for example, a whole rice flour that is much more interesting than use, for example, with white flour. No? That doesn't have much more vitamins and minerals inside, and fats, for example, that in wheat we have fats that are so interesting for our body, and we lose all these kind of ingredients on the process of preparation of these white flours. No? And always we try to push whole sugars and whole flours, because this is much more interesting for the profile of our product, for the nutritional profile, and like that we take care of the people that is consuming this kind of pastry. Okay, what happens when we use with a meringue with whole sugars? Here we have to be careful, because in whole sugars there is some minerals that interact on the creation of the network of the proteins that we have on the whites. No? For example, coconut sugar, there is some minerals inside that interact on the creation of the links that we need to create for introduce air inside of the meringue. And sometimes what's happened is that we are going to whisk the egg whites, and when we have the first part of the process, 4 or 5 minutes, and the egg whites are in soft peaks, we add coconut sugar, and we lose all the air. No? And this problem, why we have this problem? For this reason, because coconut sugar, sometimes panela, or whole cane sugars, they have some minerals that interact with the proteins that we have in the egg whites, and what they do is to weak the proteins, and we lose all the air, and there is no other option to improve the stability of these meringues. No? That means that once we have this problem, we have to change the meringue. No? And what is the solution of this problem? The solution is to add, for example, egg white protein. No? Once we reinforce, we add more protein to the meringue, we are going to solve this problem. That means that in that recipe, for example, that we share with you, we have 37% of sugar, whole sugar, like coconut sugar or panela sugar or whole cane sugar. Then we have 3% of egg white powder, albumin, and then we have 60% of egg whites. In the process, what we are going to do is just to start to whisk the egg whites with the egg white powder with albumin. We are going to start to whisk during more or less 4 minutes at 30 degrees. We are going to heat up a little bit at the beginning to improve the development of the proteins. And once we see that we have soft peaks, that we see that the meringue have body, we are going to add the sugar in general in ones. No? That this is something that maybe you are going to ask to me, that why sometimes the sugar, no, some chefs, they say to put in different times. Let's go to answer this at the end. Okay, that means that when we are going to work with meringues with whole sugars, no, if you want, you can just ask me whole sugars. What kind of whole sugars you can use in your pastry, and I'm going to try to answer if this is going to work in that direction or not, okay? But in general, when we use whole sugars in a meringue, you have to be careful to introduce much more protein, adding albumin, egg white powder on the meringue, and like that you are going to keep the right stability in your meringue. Now it's time to share. We are going just to share a small video of 5 minutes where we explain our big concept online course, extended version. Then I'm going just to explain a little bit of this course, and for sure if you have any questions about the course, feel free to ask me. And then we will finish with the presentation, because we have 2 different meringues that I want to propose to you in order to remove sugar from the recipes that we can prepare in pastry. Hi, I'm Jordi Bordas, World Pastry Champion and the creator of the V-Concept method. Together with my team, I have created a unique online pastry course. Everything started when I was 14 years old, working in my parents' bakery. With time, I discovered that pastry was my language, my way to communicate and express myself. With a lot of training and experience under my belt, in 2011, I won the World Pastry Championship. This was a very special moment that became a turning point in my life. After becoming World Pastry Champion, I realized I wasn't free creating my recipes, and I started following a healthy lifestyle. But my recipes did not reflect that. I understood that the world has changed, but pastry remained the same. I started studying each recipe. I needed the freedom to create my recipes, and I needed a method. I spent a lot of time investigating ingredients and techniques, looking for answers to my questions. And this was the beginning of the V-Concept method, a method to create healthier, lighter, and tastier recipes from scratch. In 2015, I opened my pastry school in Viladecans, where we have taught the method to more than 1,000 students. In 2020, we opened our R&D center and created this unique online course. Now you can take this course.
We introduce you to the online extended version of the V-Concept course. In this course, composed of 4 different parts, you will learn how to formulate and create your own pastry recipes. In the first part, you will learn everything about water, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, the molecules that make up all our ingredients. Knowing their physicochemical and functional properties will give you the knowledge that you need to work with any pastry ingredient. Through the second part, you will be able to master emulsification, aeration, thickening, and gelation, 4 techniques that are essential for creating perfectly balanced pastry textures. In the third part, you will learn how to formulate recipes using the V-Concept method. We will show you over 30 practical cases and give you the keys to create healthier, lighter, and tastier recipes. In the last part, we will show you step by step how to execute a collection of pastry creations. We will give you many practical tips so you can apply them in your daily work. The course includes more than 40 hours of videos, a theory book of over 300 pages and countless recipes. You will also be able to participate in forums and live webinars to solve all your doubts and interact with other students. You will put your knowledge to test, with different assignments and self-evaluation tests, and by completing them, you will earn your training certificate. But don't worry, we will guide you and help you all along the way.
If you love pastry and want to understand all the processes and reactions behind your recipes, this is the course you have been waiting for.
It is a perfect course for any pastry chef wanting to share their values through their creations.
Maybe you want to redesign and adapt your recipes so that they fit better your customers' needs.
Or you need to balance your recipes, resolving any stability, texture, or taste issues.
And if you are looking for a course to learn how to save time and resources, look no more.
To take the course, you only need a device with internet connection, pen, paper, and a desire to learn.
Throughout this course, we will give you all the tools that you need to become independent at creating your own pastry collection.
Master the big concept method and tap into your infinite creative potential.
You will be surprised at what you can achieve once you complete this course.
Come and join us. I think that in this video we perfectly explain what we do in this course. We created this course 3 years ago when pandemic arrived. We've been working 10 persons, our 10 people of the team during 1 year to create all these contents. And why we created the concept 10 years ago? The reason was because I was working in pastry. I won the Coupe du Monde of pastry in 2011, and for me it was not possible to work in recipes that I don't understand why I'm using these ingredients, for example, or how I can change the recipes. And this was a big problem for me, and for this reason I started to study ingredients, to study techniques, to try to find a way to explain to the other people how to manage and how to adjust recipes. And finally in 2014 we created this method that is a big concept method, and we call big concept, B, that comes from the option B. In general, what we do and what we learn in pastry schools is just one recipe with ingredients, with a process, and we can do only this option. And for me this was like crazy. I cannot work in pastry and work only with the classical recipes that exist. And little by little, when we started to understand ingredients and technique, we started to create this method step by step, where you can learn how to create your own recipes adapted to your necessities. Even if you want to work with classic recipes and you want to work with classic ingredients, you will learn how to manage and how to adjust on the formulation process these ingredients to, for example, to create recipes with less fat, less sweetness, and adapt to your necessities. And then in the course we explain a huge quantity of recipes, like for example vegan recipes, how to reduce costs on the recipes, how to create recipes with a much more flavor, because it's something that we have a huge problem in pastry, that all the recipes, all of them contains dairy products and in general egg yolks. And these two ingredients, we always explain that in the concept method, these two ingredients, they work as a aromatic. That means that these two ingredients we are going to use when we need flavor of dairy products or we need flavor of egg yolk. And we are not going to prepare, for example, chocolate mousse using these ingredients, because the taste of the cacao beans that we've been using in this chocolate is going to completely change. It's just a few examples. The next October 9th, we are going to start with a new edition in English, where you can learn in a path of 9 months, you will learn how to create your own recipes. And we will start explaining molecules at the beginning. We need to understand how works water, we need to understand how works the proteins, how works carbohydrates in our recipes, and like that you are going to understand how the ingredients in pastry they work and how to switch on the recipes. And once we understand this, we are going to explain the 4 basic techniques that we use in pastry that are emulsification, gelation, thickening, and aeration. And once you control molecules, ingredients, and techniques, we can start with the formulation part. Is the step-by-step, the big concept method, where you can create, for example, creamies, compotes, jellies, ganaches, mousses in any direction. And here we are going to explain different families. That means that I'm going to explain how to make, for example, recipes with dairy products, how to make recipes with acidic fruits, how to make recipes with, for example, less acidic fruits, how to make recipes with alcohols, with nuts, vegan recipes, now how to make vegan mousses. Now, and we are going to explain all of this on the 3rd module. And in this 3rd module, we will have 3 webinars, live webinars, where we are going to work together in order to create recipes with me. And at the end, you have the 4th module that we have 12 products that we created, 12 products, where we explain in each recipe of these 12 products, we explain how we achieve the stability in that recipe, why we are using these ingredients, what are the changes that we can do, no, changing the different ingredients that we have on the recipes. And like that, you are going to see a big quantity of examples how to manage your own recipes in pastry. And that's it. The total access is 14 months. That means that you will have more than 1 year connection, but are the first 9 months that you will have completely experience that is going to change your life, I'm sure. But because the problem that we have in pastry that almost all of us, we work without any knowledge about ingredients, techniques, and formulation part in pastry. And that's it. If you want more information, just feel free to contact us in the address in our website. You will have our direction. You will have all the information about this course, and any questions that you have, feel free to contact us. And now I want to finish with the 2 meringues that we have to explain, and then I want to start with some of the questions that we have. And we have one question from Cesar Perez from Cusco, Peru, amazing place. I'm going to answer. I'm not sure if I have this answer, but feel free if you have more questions about meringue or other questions that you have in pastry, and we will try to help you. Okay, let's go for the 2 last meringues. No, we have a meringue with fiber, with oligofructose. Mira, quasi que deixis la presentació d'abans, la de les 4 rodetes. Vale, perfecte, Ramon. We have a meringue with fiber, with oligofructose. And what is oligofructose? Oligofructose is a fiber that comes from inulin. No? That means that we produce inulin from the chicory root in Europe. In other countries, in other places of the world, can be produced from other plants, but in general, in Europe, we produce inulin for chicory root. They extract the inulin by using hot water and the chicory root inside, and that means that they heat the water with the chicory root, and they bring all the fiber and nutrients that we have in chicory root to the water. And then this syrup, that we have a kind of syrup rich in fiber, what they do is just to remove everything and just keep a part of water and the fiber that we have. And this syrup is where it comes from inulin. No? In this syrup, what they do first is to evaporate, for example, water, and we will have native inulin, that is a fiber that we can find in a lot of vegetables. And this fiber, no, and fiber in general is something that we have to consume. And the problem that we have, for example, in Europe, or the problem that we have, for example, in US, is that we don't consume enough fiber every day. No? A man needs to consume like 35 grams per day, and a woman needs to consume more or less 26 grams per day. And in general, in these areas of the world, we don't consume enough fiber every day. No? That means that fiber is so interesting, first because we increase the consumption, daily consumption of fiber, no? And then fiber is so interesting because catch a lot of water and give us stability on the recipes. No? That means that we can, for example, reduce fats, we can reduce sugars, and introduce fiber as an ingredient that is going to help us to keep the same stability as we have a recipe with full of sugars, full of fat, that is in general unhealthy recipes. No? And with fiber will be much more interesting the profile that we have this kind of recipes. Okay? Once we have this inulin in powder, this is native inulin. Native inulin has short and long chains of molecules. No? That means that we will have short chains that they have a low water catchment capacity, and then we have long chains that they have a huge water catchment capacity. What is the difference between native inulin and oligofructose? Oligofructose comes from the native inulin. No? What they do is when we have the native inulin with water, that is a syrup, they introduce, for example, enzymes that these enzymes, that what they do is to cut the nets, no? the links that we have of the molecules, and they cut, no, the size, and we have like small sizes, no? And that means that the difference between oligofructose and native inulin is that native inulin has short chains and long chains, and oligofructose has only short chains of molecules. No? And the difference are these. The difference is that oligofructose has more sweetness capacity. That means that, for example, as a reference, we use sugar, that 1% of sugar is 1 point of sweetness. 1% of native inulin is 0.1 points of sweetness. And then once we have 1% of oligofructose, it's 0.5 sweetness. That means that native inulin is 10 times less sweet than sugar, and oligofructose is half sweet than sugar. No? That means that oligofructose is going to give us to reduce sugar in a recipe. For example, in a compote, I can introduce oligofructose. I'm going to reduce sugar sensation. I'm going to reduce sweetness. I'm going to reduce sugar on the recipe, and we will keep a similar sweetness points. No? That means that we can, for example, use 5, 6, 10%, even 15% of oligofructose in a recipe of a compote gelée, and we will reduce sweetness and the sugar that we have on the recipes, and keeping more or less the same water catchment capacity that we have in sugar. No? If we are going to change in this recipe with native inulin has much more water catchment capacity, and then inulin also has less sweetness capacity than, for example, oligofructose or sugar. No? That means that these two ingredients we can use for adjust sweetness on the recipes, keeping the same structure, the same quantity of dry extract, and like that we will have healthier version of our pastries, healthier version of our recipes that we can produce in pastry. And in this case, what we did was to use oligofructose, this oligofructose that comes from the native inulin, to keep a sweet meringue. That means that in this 40% of oligofructose that we have in that meringue is going to give us in total 20 points of sweetness. No? And for example, in that recipe that we have 40% of sugar and 60% of egg whites, we will have 40 points of sweetness. No? That means that sugar is 2 times more sweet, no? Double sweet than oligofructose. And oligofructose is a fiber that helps us to improve, for example, the digestion process. No? Then we have oligofructose that has low water catchment capacity, similar to the sugar. No? For this reason, in that recipe, this is a kind of French meringue, we can say, we are using 40% of oligofructose and 60% of egg whites, no? Like sugar. But once we move to the inulin, Here we have high water catchment capacity, and we need to reduce the quantity of fiber. No, that means that we are working in 30% of native inulin and 70% of egg whites, because this 70% of egg whites is going to introduce much more water on the recipe of our meringue, and this meringue is going to keep a good stability. If we introduce much more inulin in the recipe, this fiber is going to absorb water, and the meringue will be too thick. We will lose the capacity of the proteins to introduce the air inside, and the meringue will be not good. No? That means that always, if you work, for example, with native inulin, better work in a proportion of 30% of native inulin, 70% of egg whites. And once you use, for example, fibers that they have low water catchment capacity, like can be oligofructose, or for example, corn fiber, that there is completely different types of fibers in the market. You can use 40% of fiber and 60% of egg whites. Okay. Now I'm going to explain both the process of meringue with oligofructose. Podemos enseñarlo, Ramón. Meringue with oligofructose, that means that here we have the same, 60% of egg whites, 40% of oligofructose. We are going to see now what is allulose, and the process is whisk the same, whisk during 4 minutes in the standing mixer at medium-high speed. That means 80% of the speed. Once we start to whisk, we heat up at 30 degrees, and like that the proteins, they are going to develop much better. Once we have soft peaks, that we have volume, we add oligofructose or allulose, and then just we finish to whisk 6 minutes more, and we can use this meringue in any recipes of mousses. Okay. What is allulose? Allulose is a rare sugar. We are going to share with you a link, because this allulose is so interesting, because we have almost 0 glycemic index and has a low calorie sweetness ingredient. It's interesting because can work like a sugar. That means that we can switch almost in all the recipes 1-to-1. We did a lot of tests these last weeks, and we saw that, for example, in sponges, in creamies, in compotes, in ganaches, works as a sugar. No? The difference is low calorie, almost 0, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Then has low sweetness, a little bit low sweetness. That means that sugar is 1% of sugar, 1 point of sweetness. Allulose is 1% of allulose is 0.7 points of sweetness. That means that it's a little bit less sweet than sugar. And it's interesting, for example, for diabetic people that cannot consume recipes with high quantity of sugar and high quantity of carbohydrates. Allulose is a good option for this kind of pastry. And if you want to produce pastry without sugar, is also a good option. No? Here in Europe, they are working in order to be possible to use it, because it's not possible to use in Europe, but in all the rest of the countries in general, you can use allulose. No? For example, in South America, I think in all the countries you can use without any problem. North America, there is no problem. You can buy even you can buy in the supermarkets, and we can use in pastry. In some countries in Asia, like Korea, for example, we can use also. That means that it's an ingredient that little by little is arriving to us, and I hope that will be the solution to create better and sugar-free pastries, because the options that we have right now, like for example xylitol, erythritol, all these kind of polyalcohols are not so healthy. No? That means that maybe we can consume sometimes, but it's not so good for the health, and also for pastry is, no, from my opinion, are not so interesting, because they have aftertaste that is not interesting, and the capacity to give us a structure on the recipes is not so interesting. No? That means that For the test that we did with Allolose, we think that this will be the ingredient of the future that will help us to work without sugar on the recipes, okay? And this recipe of French meringue with oligofructose allulose, you can work in the same direction. That means that you can use oligofructose or allulose, no? And you will have with allulose a meringue that will be a little bit more sweet than with oligofructose. And both meringues, the meringue with oligofructose and the meringue with allulose, is going to caramelize. That means that you can prepare, like for example, a meringue, if you want to caramelize this meringue for a plate dessert, for example, it's going to work perfectly, okay? Let's go to see another option. I'm going to give you an option, for example, of this kind of French meringue with oligofructose allulose, but with a good stability, for example, for prepare a lemon pie, no? What's happened is that this meringue with 60% of pasteurized egg whites and 40% allulose or oligofructose is not stable for piping, for example, for a lemon pie, no? You will see that maybe in 1 hour the water is going to leak out, no? And it's going to be completely separate in 4 or 5 hours, no? What is the solution here if you want to work without sugar and you want to work a perfect stability in your meringue, but not using the classic recipes that contains a lot of sugar and a cooking process? The solution is to use native inulin in team with oligofructose or allulose. That means that instead of use 40% of oligofructose or allulose, I'm going to use 20% of oligofructose or allulose, and the rest of 20% will be native inulin. And you will work in team. That means that you will have 60% of egg whites, 20% of oligofructose or allulose, it depends the goals that you have in that meringue, and then you will have 20% of native inulin. And like that, you will have a perfect stability that will come from the long chains that we have in native inulin. This is going to give you a perfect stability, and this meringue you can keep in a fridge like 2 days without any problem, okay? That means that is another option that just explained to you how to make a perfect stable meringue by using fibers that can be so interesting. And this option of meringue is so interesting because it's less sweet, because if there is something that I don't like too much from the lemon pie is that you have a meringue that contains a lot of sugar, because in general it's Italian meringue with a high quantity of sugar and it's very sweet. And then you have a lemon cream that contains also a lot of sugar, and we have egg yolk taste, we have butter taste, and in general these flavors I don't like too much, no? And it's awful the quantity of sugar that we can have in that recipe. And working like that, as I mentioned, no, working in a meringue with egg whites and fibers and oligofructose or allulose can be a really interesting option. And at the end, here we have the process of French meringue with native inulin. That is 70% of egg whites and 30% of inulin, and the process is exactly the same. The only difference between these meringues, the ones that we explained before, and this one is that this has to be used at the end of the process. That means that in general, Italian meringue, Swiss meringue, classic recipes of meringue, the other recipes that we shared with you, you can just at the end of the process reduce the speed of your standing machine, and you can keep like 10-15 minutes and until you are going to use. But when we use, for example, with inulin, we have to prepare the meringue and use it directly, because if not, what happens is that the fibers of native inulin, they start to absorb water in a high speed, and what they do is to reduce the volume in this meringue. That means that we are going to prepare the whole recipe. Once we have the whole recipe prepared, we start to whisk egg whites, add inulin, 10 minutes, and then we mix everything, and that's it, okay? That means that we have to use right now when we finish, okay? And now I'm going to start with the questions that we have. Feel free. I see 2 questions from Cesar and Maribel. Thank you very much to make questions. This is so interesting for learn all of us, and I have like 6-10 questions that I'm going to answer because we need to understand different parameters in meringue in order to work on the right direction, okay? And then feel free, if you have questions, please share with us, okay? Let's go to start with the first question. Why do we sometimes add albumin powder to a meringue, no? As I mentioned, one goal to add albumin powder in a meringue is to improve the stability of that meringue, no? For example, imagine that I'm going to work with whole sugars and I need to improve the stability of the egg whites. I can introduce albumin powder that is protein, and the more protein we introduce, more stability we will have in that meringue, no? That means that using whole sugars, we need, okay? Once we use, for example, pasteurized egg whites, because what happened in the pasteurized egg whites is that sometimes in the process of pasteurization, what we do is to weaken the proteins, no? And what we have at the end, no, when we use this kind of egg white proteins, is that structures that are not so hard, no? And for this reason, in this kind of meringues where we are using egg whites, pasteurized egg whites, we can introduce egg white powder, albumin, in order to improve the stability in this kind of meringues. And then also is, for example, another example is interesting to add egg white powder in recipes where, for example, we are going to mix a meringue with a part of the recipe that contains a lot of fat, no? For example, I remember that we have one recipe, a cheesecake mousse, that we have cheesecake, water, gelatin, and we blend all this part, and then we prepare a meringue, for example, with egg whites, sugar, in order to have sweetness, and then inulin. This meringue, what happens is that when we work with egg white pasteurized, when we have a meringue with egg white pasteurized, the stability is not so good, no? And what we do is to introduce, even working with white sugar and inulin, we introduce egg white protein, and like that we have much more body in this meringue, and we can mix the quantity of fat that comes from the cream cheese to the meringue without losing the air that we have inside, no? It's another option why we have to add albumin powder in the meringues, no? Not always we need to use, no? Only when we need this kind of functions in our meringue. What is the role of cream of tartar in a meringue? This is a very good question, no? Why we need to use cream of tartar? What happens is that when we work with pasteurized egg whites, in general, we don't use, no? Why we don't use? Because on the pasteurization process of the egg whites, they weaken the proteins, they weaken the capacity of the proteins to create a hard network on the whisking process, and for this reason, in general, in egg white proteins, in general, in egg whites, when they are pasteurized, we don't use cream of tartar. But when we are using fresh egg whites, we always use cream of tartar. That means that before to start to use these egg whites, in general, what I do is to mix between 5 to 20 grams of cream of tartar to the fresh egg whites. I mix with a whisk, for example, and then I start to scale the quantity that I need for each recipe, no? Another possibility to work in that direction is that you scale the quantity that you need in each meringue, no? What I recommend to you is, if you are working with fresh egg whites, is to introduce between 5 to 20 grams at the beginning, and then you are going to use directly the egg whites with cream of tartar inside. And what is going to give us cream of tartar on the recipes? The cream of tartar gives us flexibility. That means that it's going to create links between the proteins that we have on the egg whites, but this network will be a little bit softer and will be much more flexible. That means that this is going to give us much more time for working with this meringue, no? What's happened when we work only with fresh egg whites and sugar, what's happened is that once we stop the standing machine, we are going to see that the meringue is going to be a block. No? To avoid this is using cream of tartar. No? That means that cream of tartar gives us much more flexibility on the meringue. We have to use always. I use always only when I work with fresh egg whites. When I use pasteurized egg whites, in general, I don't use. That means that if I have to prepare a meringue for a mousse, that I know that I'm going just to prepare the meringue and mix and use this recipe, here I don't use cream of tartar. But once I need, for example, to keep the meringue flexible during long time for piping, no? Imagine, for example, that I want to prepare a recipe with pasteurized egg whites, sugar or oligofructose or allulose, and I want to use that recipe for piping a lemon pie cake, no? And I need long time because are small pieces and I need like 20 minutes working time of that meringue. I'm going to use cream of tartar, no? And the quantity is between 5 to 20 grams, no? It depends. You can start with 5 grams per liter of egg whites. Then if you see that you don't have enough time for using your meringue and your meringue starts to set or gelify, we are going to say, too fast, you introduce more quantity on the next preparation of meringue. And like that until you have the quantity that you need. Okay? That means that cream of tartar, flexibility, and much more time for the mixing process of our recipes. Is it advisable to add a little bit of salt to meringue? No, it's better to avoid this. Salt is going to weak the proteins, no, directly to weak. That means that these proteins, even they are going to lose the capacity to catch the air, no, and create a good network inside of our meringue. That means that in general, we avoid the use of salt inside of the meringues. It's better to use always cream of tartar or, for example, lemon juice. If you don't have cream of tartar, just a little bit of lemon juice inside of your meringue, and this is going to give you the flexibility that we need for work in our meringue. What should I do if my meringue won't whip up? No? That means that in general, we have fat inside of the standing machine. That means that maybe the whisk contains some fats inside, no? And this, once we mix the egg whites, the fat that we have on the whisk or on the bowl doesn't allow the egg whites to whisk on the right direction. And another possibility is that we are using, for example, pasteurized egg whites, and these pasteurized egg whites, they are over pasteurized. That means that the cooking process or the pasteurization process was not right, and the egg whites, they lose the capacity to whisk, no? And this is because they weak or they overcook the proteins that we have inside, no? And sometimes this is a problem that we have, no? And sometimes we buy egg whites that will start to whisk, and we see that in 2, 3, 4 minutes there is no way to whisk this meringue, no? And the problem is because these egg whites, they were over pasteurized. The other problem can be too much fat inside of the tools that we are using, no? Fat inside of the tools that we are using in our preparation, no? And another problem can be that if you are using fresh egg whites and we just remove the egg yolk, and sometimes we keep a small quantity of egg yolk on the egg whites, what happens is that the fat that we have on the egg yolks is going to avoid completely the creation of this network with the egg white proteins, no? That means that try to avoid fat on the egg whites in any direction and try to use pasteurized egg whites that are with good quality. How to prevent the overwhipping process of the meringue? We have to control the speed, no? That means that be careful, no? To don't whisk in a high speed too much time. And then it's so important to introduce cream of tartar inside when you use fresh egg whites, no? That means that always 80% of the speed on your whisking machine, controlling the time, no? That means that in general, using pasteurized egg whites like we use, for example, in 10 minutes process is okay. And once we use fresh egg whites, what we add is cream of tartar, and like that we are sure that we don't have the problem of overwhipping. Can sugar be substituted with any other type of sweetener? For sure, we can use allulose. This is one option. Without sugar will be the recipe. We can use oligofructose. In Europe, oligofructose, 100% of oligofructose is 100% of fiber, but we have to mention that in general in oligofructose we have like 20% of sugars that are free. That means that we have some fructose, we have some glucose that are free. No? That means that we have 80% of fiber and 20% of sugars. No? But anyway, oligofructose is declared in Europe like a 1% fiber. And then for sure we can use erythritol, xylitol, or maltitol, for example. But this kind of polyalcohols that we can use in pastry, they need to be heated. I prefer in general when I use this kind of ingredients to heat up until 50 degrees the whites. No? For example, by using the heating gun or the torch, we heat the egg whites until 50 degrees and we add the erythritol, xylitol, we continue to heat up, and like that we are sure that this erythritol, this xylitol is going to be completely dissolved and melted. No? And like that the final result will be much better than if we work only at 30 degrees. Okay? What happens if we reduce the amount of sugar too much? No? If we reduce too much the sugar that we have in a meringue, what's happening is that we are losing dry extract, that give us sugar or other kind of ingredients, and we are going to lose the stability of that recipe. That means that always we need to use a minimum of dry extract, that is around 35-40% if you are using a kind of ingredients like, for example, sugar, for example, or allulose or erythritol, or for example oligofructose. Once we move to, for example, native inulin, here we have to reduce the quantity because the more water catchment capacity we have on the dry ingredients that we use in a meringue, the less quantity we have to use in this meringue. Okay? Now I see a few questions that I'm going to try to answer. Just let me 1 second that I'm going to drink a little bit of water. I'm going to start with this question from Cesar from Cusco, Peru. This is an amazing place. I was 1 year ago, more or less, I was in Cusco. It's an amazing place, really tall, because we have like 3,460 meters tall above the sea. And here it means that water is going to boil very, very fast. If I'm not mistaken, Cesar, the boiling point in Cusco, maybe it's 85 degrees, maybe you have water boiling. I'm not sure about this answer. What we can do, if you want to email us in our address, and I'm going to check this with Adriana because I'm not sure what is the answer of this question, because I'm thinking, for example, when we are using baking powder in this kind of places in the world, what we do is to reduce 10 times the percentage of baking powder, and for example there is some ingredients like agar-agar that we cannot use because the boiling point of water is 85, 90, 92 degrees, and when we use agar-agar, for example, we need 95 grams minimum in order to hydrate the agar-agar, and then this agar-agar is going to set. But in this kind of recipes, like for example Italian meringue, I'm not sure what is the right answer. Okay, let me check. If you want to email us, and I'm going to check with Adriana the answer, and we will try to help you. Okay, because I'm not sure. I was there just in holidays. That was amazing, but I'm not sure what is the answer in that question. Maribel Gonzalez, I'm going to share with you. The humidity of the environment, or the opposite, will affect the meringue structure. In general, Maribel, we don't have this problem. That means that let me know if I'm not on the right direction of the answer in that question. What's happened is that once we have the meringue, no, the egg whites, sorry, we start to whisk. We add the water, the sugar. We prepare that meringue and we mix in a mousse, for example. The humidity is not going to give us any problems. But there is another possibility. If we are going to prepare, for example, Italian meringue, no, and we are going to pipe this Italian meringue in top of a lemon tart, no, for example, and we are going to keep like 4 days or 3 days or 2 days in a fridge that has high quantity of humidity. That means that you have like 80–90% of humidity inside your fridge. Can be the problem that the sugar that we have in the meringue is going to be not stable and we are going to lose water in that kind of meringue. No, this can be a possibility, but I'm not sure if this is the direction of your question. Feel free if you want to make another time the question. Explain me just an example that will be easier for me to understand where comes from this problem, and I will try to help you. Okay. Hello Jordi, is possible to name the sweeteners you mentioned in order to sweetness? Okay, let's go to see. Sadaf, thank you for your question. Hello Jordi, it's possible to name the sweeteners that you mentioned in order to sweetness and stability they provide. Thanks in advance. In general, I think that I mentioned oligofructose. We have allulose, we have erythritol, and then we have xylitol, no, that are other sweeteners that we can use in pastry in order to remove sugar from the recipes. And all of them, they have more or less the same water catchment capacity and the same stability, okay, more or less. And also, what is interesting to use in this kind of recipes is inulin, no, in team. That means that, for example, erythritol or xylitol or oligofructose or allulose is going to give us sweetness on the recipe, and inulin is going to help us to keep the good stability. That means that, for example, as I mentioned, we can prepare a French meringue for a lemon pie using, for example, 20% of erythritol or 20% of xylitol or 20% of oligofructose or 20% of allulose, and the rest of 20% will be native inulin that is going to give us the stability that we need on the recipe, and the rest will be 60% of egg whites. And we are going to prepare in cold way, yeah? That means French meringue. I'm going to whisk the egg whites. Once we have the egg whites at 30 degrees and we have soft peaks, we add, for example, oligofructose and native inulin. We finalize to whisk 6 more minutes, and then we can pipe on top of a lemon pie, and this is going to work perfectly, okay? That means that this kind of sweeteners, they have low water catchment capacity, and we can work in team with native inulin in order to balance the situation and have more control of the water that we have. And like that, we are going to lose the problem that we have in general, no? Because in general, with a lot of meringues, sometimes we have the problem that water is leaking out of the recipe because we don't have enough stability on the recipe. Another question from Sima, just 1 second. We are going to share, hi Sima, thank you for our webinar. Thank you for following us. No, we don't talk it about cooked meringue, but just I can talk to you. No, few things. No, what is important in a cooked meringue, no, like pavlova, is that we need to understand that we are using sugars as an ingredient that is going to give us a structure. No. And there is a process that is the recrystallization of saccharose that we have once we dry pavlova in an oven, that is going to give us the crunchy sensation that we have, for example, in pavlova, that we have in a dry meringue, that we have, for example, in a macaron. No? The problem is that once we start to reduce sugar, or once we mix sugar with erythritol, with xylitol, with oligofructose, with fibers in general, the saccharose that we will have on the recipe is not going to recrystallize, and we are going to completely lose the crunchy sensation. That means that in general, I always say that in macaron, in pavlova, in baked and cooked meringue, it's not possible to use other kind of ingredients that are not sugar saccharose. No, we cannot use glucose for sure, because glucose has a high anti-crystallizing capacity, and that means that this glucose, for example, or dextrose or maltodextrin, is going to completely avoid the recrystallization of sugar in our recipes. Fiber is exactly the same. If we are going to use fiber, we are going to avoid the recrystallization of sugar, and if we use only fiber, we don't have recrystallization of sugar, and what's happening is that our meringue is completely, when we dry, is completely elastic, no? And this is not so interesting. What's happening is that sometimes if we use, for example, a small percentage of fibers, no, that means that, for example, 5% of fibers mixed with saccharose, we can reduce a little bit the sweetness in pavlova, for example, in a dry meringue. And we will have crunchy texture, but always we will lose a little bit of crunchy texture. No? That means that we can add a small quantity of fiber, but we have to be careful, because if we increase the quantity in a huge percentage, we are going to have a flexible structure and we will lose the crunchy sensation. And this is no, because we have to understand that saccharose, no, sugar, white sugar, or whole cane sugar or coconut sugar, they contain a huge quantity of saccharose, and what this saccharose do is going to recrystallize and is going to give us this crunchy structure. But it's crunchy, not elastic. No, it's not like a chewing gum. No, it's just crunchy sensation. No? And for this reason, all these kind of fibers, for example, and polyalcohols are not so interesting to use, because in general we lose the capacity to have recrystallization process and have crunchy sensation. No? Here I have a question. We have a question from Monica. Thank you, Monica. Hello, chef. What about trehalose? Can we use for a meringue? Yes, for sure. I don't have too much information with trehalose because we don't use too much trehalose in our pastries. You can find, I'm sure, a lot of information, for example, in Wikipedia and Google, I'm sure. But for sure, we can use trehalose in a meringue and prepare the same meringue that we shared with you with oligofructose or with allulose, the same percentage with trehalose. And this meringue will have the characteristics that we have with trehalose. Trehalose is different, the sweetness is less than sugar, the water catchment capacity I think is a little bit more than sugar. It's some parameters that you can find in Google, for example, or Wikipedia, or any companies that produce trehalose that is going to explain to you. But we don't use too much because we prefer to use fibers in order to make and have much more stability and in the recipes and healthier version, because we have to think that trehalose has not low glycemic index. No? And for example, when we use fibers like, for example, native inulin, the glycemic index is almost less than 10, and when we use oligofructose, is more or less 20. No? That means that it's a really low glycemic index ingredient. No? And for this reason, we don't use too much trehalose in our pastries. Okay, Cesar, thank you. You can email us. We will try to answer and help you. And yes, totally agree. Altitude is a big deal. No, it's a really completely huge challenge, no, to make pastry in Cusco because you are very tall. No. Then we have. Hello, it's possible to use natural sweetener, like for example. Okay, let's go to share this. That this question is interesting. No. Hello, thank you, Vin. It's possible to use natural sweetener, like for example, date sugar or maple syrup to make meringue? Yes, for sure. The only thing that you have to be careful with date sugar is that needs to be perfectly, completely green. Needs to be like sugar crystals, no? Cannot be pieces of date, no? This is logic because we need to have a perfectly dry and small size of molecules of date sugar, no? And for sure you can use the same recipe that we propose to you for whole sugars, no? That means that you are going to use more or less 30, if I'm not mistaken, 37% of sugar, 3% of egg white protein in powder, and 60% of egg whites. And you can use this sugar, for example, for a mousses. There is no problem. And with maple syrup, exactly the same. You can use, works amazing. The only thing that we have to be careful because maple syrup contains a little bit of water, around 20%. That means that if we are going to use 40% in a meringue of maple syrup, we will have around 8% of water. And maybe we will need to add a little bit of egg white powder. No? That means that, for example, a recipe with maple syrup will be the same recipe that we are using for whole sugars, but instead to use only 3% of egg white protein, we can use 5% of egg white protein, reduce the quantity of syrup, and 60% of egg whites. And like that, you will have a perfect balance. And this egg white protein that we will add to the recipe is going to help us to stabilize this water that comes from the syrup. Okay? Thank you for the question. Let's go to see the next question from Bint. Thank you. You say that we need to keep the dry extract at minimum between 30 to 35% when reducing sugar in a meringue. This is when we are thinking in meringues that we are going to use, for example, in mousses, we have to think in that direction, okay? If you are going to work, for example, with meringues that we want to keep, for example, for a lemon pie, here will be better to introduce a little bit more dry extract, like, for example, around 40, 45, even 50% in total, okay? Working with, for example, sugar sweeteners plus fibers on the recipe. Is there any same every, just let me see the recipe, the question. Just 1 second. What can we use to have enough dry extract when we are reducing sugar? I explained it. I think I already give you the answer. No, if we want to reduce sugar, we can use fibers in order to balance your recipe. No, that means that imagine that you have a classic recipe of French meringue that contains 60% of sugar and 40% of egg whites, and that recipe works well for what you need. No, but you want to reduce sugar in the recipe. What you can do is, instead of use 60%, for example, of sugar, you can use only 40% of sugar, and the rest of 20% you can use, for example, oligofructose or allulose. And like that, you are going to reduce the sweetness, you are going to reduce the quantity of sugar on your recipe. This recipe, it depends the ingredient that you are going to use on the substitution will be much more healthier, but you will have the same, more or less the same stability. That means that you remove one ingredient, you add another ingredient in order to have the same stability. And you add an ingredient that has much more or less the same water catchment capacity. Okay? Let's go. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Bin. Thank you, Sima. Lana. Question, recommended sugar protein ratio for vegetable protein meringue. This is, thank you for your question, Lana. This is, we are going to prepare a webinar, I think, with a just vegan meringues, because vegan meringues are so interesting, no? That means that we are going to work on that on the next weeks, and we will try to fix a webinar like this one, but only explaining about vegan meringues with vegetable proteins, because this is a challenge and this is so interesting. Okay, if I can answer your questions, what type of vegetal proteins can we use for a stable meringue? In general, we are using, I'm going just to make a small piece of your question, okay? We are using two kinds of proteins. We are using soy protein, that is so interesting, but the only thing that you have to keep in mind is that soy protein needs to be 90% concentration. That means that when you're going to see the nutritional facts of your protein, soy protein, you have to see 90% of concentration. That means that you will have proteins 90%. If not, it's not going to work. And then another type of vegetal protein that we use is potato protein. No, we have different potato proteins, different companies that they work well. We work in general with Sosa company, that is one of our partners in our school. And this potato protein is so interesting because we have also a good stability in vegan meringue, okay? What stabilizing agents are disabled to use additionally? In general, always when we use vegetal proteins, we have to work in team with thickening agents, no? And this is something that we explain in our course. We cannot use in vegetal proteins only soy protein or potato protein. We have to work always in team, for example, with guar gum, with flax fiber, is a new product that we have from Sosa company, or we have to use, for example, with xanthan gum. No? Why? Because soy protein, potato protein is going to work on the way to create the structure, to capture the air inside of this meringue. And xanthan gum and this kind of thickeners, they are going to work to give us thickening effect on the recipe, and like that we will improve the capacity to keep the stability inside of these meringues, okay? But let's go to see if we can prepare, Lana, in some of the next weeks, just a webinar with vegan perfect meringue. This can be interesting, and we will share to you more information about that. And that's it. If you don't have more questions, we're going to finish here. Just to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you for following us and for giving us your support. Just keep in mind that the next 9th of October, we will start with a new edition of the Concept Online Extended course. And if you are interested in our course, just feel free to contact us and we will try to help you in all that is possible. Okay? Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you very much, Sima, Bin, Monica, all of you. Thank you very much. And see you soon. We keep in contact. Bye-bye. Thank you.